Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Okay, well, today we are in for a treat. I am here with Rabbi Mike Harvey. Rabbi Mike Harvey has just written a new book called Let's Talk, A Rabbi Speaks to Christians. It's quite an excellent book. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, but Rabbi Mike is a graduate and was ordained by HUC in Cincinnati. He has a master's degree in Hebrew letters. He's worked for a number of congregations throughout the Midwest. He's a social justice advocate, and he also created and continues a monthly podcast with an Episcopal priest called A Rabbi and a Priest Walk into a Bar. Mike, thank you so much for coming on J Life with Daniel.
Thank you so much for having me.
So it seems like a lot of your work is intersected in the interfaith space. Is there something that specifically inspired you that brought you to want to tailor so much of your career towards that?
You know, I can point to the exact moment when I recognized that that's where I wanted to focus my rabbinate. It was my first year in seminary at HUC. Before that, certainly I was involved in education. I liked, helping be the Jewish voice in an overall non-Jewish world and providing that informally. But when I was in my first year in HUC in Jerusalem, we had the opportunity to meet with a group of seminary students from the Swedish Institute. And they came and spoke to us. And I just loved the questions that they asked, how interested they were, how kind everybody was, and all the things that we could learn from each other, so much so that when it came time for us to return the favor and go visit their seminary, they had come to HUC, I volunteered to be the contact point, to lead that group together to do it. And I felt this buzz of, this is fruitful work, it's fun work, it's important work. And I continued that throughout my training in seminary in Cincinnati. Anytime that there would be opportunities that would arise, and they would arise, once a month, twice a month, maybe more than that, where the director would say, hey, there's a church or there's a Catholic school or something nearby, and they want someone to come and speak about Judaism. Who wants to do it? And the way that the director did it was that, first come, first serve. Whoever got to his email first got to do it. And so I rushed to do it every time. Ended up teaching at Catholic schools, ended up teaching at churches all over Ohio and beyond, and just built more and more experience in that. And so I took all the classes about that. I went on interfaith trips. If there was a summer program that was offered, whether it be at the Chautauqua Institution or the Bosse Institute in Switzerland or AJWS, American Jewish World Service, I was there. I was on it. And awesome. It became my identity as a rabbi even before I entered or exited seminary and entered my world as an ordained rabbi.
There is something really invigorating. One of my most interesting and best memories so far, I've been a rabbi in the field I just had my 5-year anniversary here, was being on an interfaith panel at a mega church here in Anaheim. It was called Eastside Christian Church. And I was so taken aback in a good way at the size of the production and just how many people came and were interested. And what I was most impressed by was actually from the point of view of the church. One of the things that I often think in terms of Judaism, which is sort of a constant theme here on this podcast, is Judaism, regardless of what strain of Jewish thought you belong to, is relatively pluralistic. We sort of have that baked in with the ethos of the Talmud and just the fact that, you ask 2 Jews any question and we'll, spread out 3 to 7 opinions depending on what it is. Oftentimes, I think there's a stereotype that Christianity is a lot more dogmatic, a lot more top down, sort of a lot less room, certainly in medieval Christianity, the sort of stereotype, a lot less room for that. So I remember being really impressed that they were willing to have me, along with a Muslim, along with a Buddhist and a Hindu, up there answering questions, not just easy questions, quote unquote, which is, what does your tradition think about God? I remember towards the end, there was a question that they asked, which is, what does your faith tradition think about Jesus? And I remember I had talked to the pastor before the panel, and I said, I'm going to have to say, at best, we don't think of him that much. Obviously, right. We can dig up, Jewish writings of not being very happy. But, so my answer was sort of, I know it may seem like Jews are the people who rejected Jesus, but from a Jewish point of view, it's like saying that Christians are the people who rejected the Quran or Allah, right? It's just, you don't base your identity around what you've rejected. And he was like, great. So go say that. It's really important that my congregants hear that. And I was really, really impressed. I'm wondering.
That is impressive.
So just in sort of the wider picture, how has that sort of been received even before getting to your book, when you were in rabbinic school and going and talking to all these various Christian groups? Were you received? Did people try to challenge you? What was that sort of like?
I've been through so many interfaith panels, interfaith lectures, interfaith services, that I've experienced pretty much the best and the worst. I think you're right when you talk about the stereotype that within Christianity, there is sort of a dogma, a creed, that there's a stability, that's not so much. However, what I learned quite quickly is that, certainly when I was in Switzerland with the World Council of Churches, is that there's 40,000 denominations of Christianity in the world, and they all have different opinions about each other and about the authenticity. And that comes out very quickly when you have more than one Christian representative on a panel. Just as if I were to sit on a panel, it'd be different from an Orthodox Jew or rabbi sitting on a panel. And so I try to keep that in mind whenever I'm called to do these things. But, I've had incredible experiences where people, even leaders, have had aha moments, that they knew nothing about Reform Judaism, or they knew nothing about, the beginnings of Judaism, or the beginnings of Christianity in first century. And I've had pretty extreme pushback. People who have said, this is how I feel, and I'm not moving about it. Or, I remember walking into a church I was supposed to speak at, and they were serving dinner, and a guy comes up to me and he says, I forget what year this was. It's got to be, 2013 or something like that. And, he was talking about the economy not doing well. And I said, yeah, no, it's sort of worrisome. And he said, well, when the Jews are worried, then I'm worried. Little things out. This was in the middle of nowhere, Ohio, but little things that I've encountered, I was stunned silence. And then now I know exactly how to, you have to train yourself how to respond, how to teach. But I've experienced, wonderfully warmer welcomes than some synagogues, frankly. And sort of the opposite of I think what people go in and saying what they fear will occur when you're in that minority. And I'll say also that I've worked with a great deal of Muslim leaders who've experienced the same, and I've stood by them during both. But I think it depends where you are and who you're talking to.
Yeah, and I have noticed just in my work on campus over the past couple of years, there has been a high number of students that are currently Christian and students with a Christian background that are just so interested in Judaism, because we obviously share some of the same foundational texts, but with radically different ways of understanding it in terms of the Talmud and Midrash and rabbinic tradition. And I just remember, over my years working on campus, just the number of Christian students I've met that have just been so fascinated, not from let me try to convince you why this makes no sense, but from I had no idea. I didn't even know the Talmud existed. I just thought Jews were just the people of, in their words, the Old Testament. And I was very confused as to how that, translated into the modern Jewish community in Los Angeles, because, for those listeners who aren't exactly familiar, reading the Torah literally and then going to any modern Jewish community, it's not exactly clear how we got from one stage to another.
Right.
So I
Sure.
always sort of think of that in the back of my head. Moving along to the book. So you had all these experiences, and what actually inspired you, if you don't mind taking maybe 30 seconds to a minute of just sort of summarizing the book, and then we'll sort of get into the inspiration for it.
Sure. The book, Let's Talk, A Rabbi Speaks to Christians, is basically not a Judaism 101 book, but rather a book that speaks about Jewish views and perspectives about Christian thought and vice versa, and how some might be problematic, things that Christians aren't taught, but Jews know, and an opportunity for us to educate each other. That's basically a elevator sale. The book itself started to take form in my last congregation in Temple Israel in West Lafayette, Indiana. Though before that, I had already started to, in my head, put together sort of the beginnings of it, and that was basically that. As you know, because I was such an interfaith rabbi and still am, whenever there was an interfaith coalition or leadership, whatever, I was there. I was the director. I was leading. I mean, I was the interfaith guy. And so I befriended so many Christian clergy, not just in my hometown, but wherever I went. And I started to get phone calls from them or emails from them saying, Mike, I'm giving a sermon on this, or our Old Testament reading, or our prophet's reading is about this, and I would love to know what you guys think about it. Is this wrong? Is this right? What's this Hebrew word mean? I'm trying to do this for, and I loved and I said, look, just send me any question, email it, call. I'm a teacher, I'm a rabbi. This is what I want to do. And then I started to see sort of patterns of answers that I would give. I'm like, well, I know you think this, but actually let me suggest this. And I started to say to myself, I don't know if every clergy group in every city has a Rabbi Mike. Maybe they do, or an equivalent. But if they don't, then wouldn't it be great if they had a handbook, if they had a book that represented these sort of things? As if you have a question about this particular view, or you don't know enough about this, or you want to learn about this, and in the back of the book, there's a scriptural index, meaning like, what is this Matthew term, or what is this, whatever it is. You've got my book for that. And that's what I wanted to put out there. I don't want Christian clergy to stop using rabbis as a resource, far from it, but I'd like them, in a pinch, to have this as a resource, as a handbook on their shelves, so that they can do what they want to do, which is teach the way that is respectful and full in terms of the Jewish and Christian perspective, and get it right.
Yeah. And it really is an incredible book. And it really doesn't just stay at surface level. I was really impressed by the level of scholarship of really getting into the weeds. I read it and I knew most of the references, but I even found myself on Wikipedia, what's this obscure reference? And so it was definitely a learning experience for me. Interestingly enough, I also, just a little bit of background, had the privilege of serving as one of the recommendations, not sure exactly if that's an adjective or verb. One of the things that I really appreciated was this attempt to take ideas, stories, narratives in the Christian world and sort of dissect them to some extent. You can tell me if I'm not phrasing this in sort of the way that you're thinking about it, but almost try to surgically remove the parts of it that could seem anti-Semitic, or the history is engulfed in anti-Semitism, while still keeping sort of the main parts. You're very careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, which is really difficult, because some people might see that and say, why are you trying to change our traditions? Other people from another side might come with an optical skeptical view, which, certainly come up when I've had conversations with friends and colleagues of mine about Christianity, which they say, well, that's not really possible. The whole thing's sort of rooted in, at least from maybe the 3rd or 4th century on, a rejection, if not downright disapproval of everything Jews are doing. So how was that process? And do you think, I know this is a very loaded question, so feel free to take this however you want. Is it possible to sort of uncover a ideal type or pure Christian theology or ideology that even somebody that's continuously steeped in that, believes it top to bottom, won't harbor any resentment towards the Jews who obviously loom large within, for sure, the New Testament, but also subsequent Christian literature?
It's a good question. It's a loaded question. I think that my market for this book, certainly there are Jews who can learn cool stuff and, be prepared so that if, someone approaches them, they've got it. Progressive Christians who know a great deal of this, but would have aha moments through that. But the real person I'm trying to get to is that person sort of in between, not on the far right, who we know is going to be offended, who's going to burn the book, who's going to say, you're telling me what to do, you're so rude, you're, all that stuff that we see. That's not really realistic in terms of, who I'm looking to read the book. But what I'm looking for is that quiet person in the church, in the pews, who holds strong views, traditional views, particular views, but isn't looking to start a fight, isn't looking to reject anything, is open a little bit to these sort of things, and will read the book. Maybe they'll agree with some things, maybe they'll disagree with some things, but it will start a conversation that they weren't sure how to have before. And trying to find that balance, I want to be respectful. This is important stuff. People think that, or believe rather, that, the Gospels are historical or sacred or divine. And so to say, we're not going to talk about that theology today. If we're going to say, we're going to pull it apart and say, actually, the anti-Semitism, the anti-Judaism here isn't a misinterpretation. It's actually a correct interpretation. And try to remember that we have the same problem on our side, right? My senior sermon at HUC years and years ago was about all the problematic aspects in the Tanakh and what are we supposed to do with them? We can't get rid of them. Should we talk about them? Should we not talk about them? Do we have to address them? How exhausting is it to always talk about, that's the conversation to have that balance there. And I think it was, through the editing process, it went sort of back and forth. Some things were a little too far. Some things didn't go far enough, depending on who you ask, I like to be gentle but stern in terms of some of the seriousness that can come out. But I only tolerate certain levels. And so that was the balance that I was trying to find.
Yeah. And I think the seriousness definitely does come out. I remember a couple of years ago, one of my professors / rabbis said something that it took me years to realize how true it was, which is we were talking about interfaith. And when I was in undergrad, I mean, this is already a number of years ago, but when I was in undergrad, I was very involved in interfaith. I was sort of the Hillel board representative to the wider interfaith community at UCLA. And I did a lot of work with different Christian groups on campus and with the Muslim Student Association on campus, and, spent a lot of my time in these spaces having these conversations. And I remember one of my rabbis who also taught a class sat me down and said, there's a really interesting thing you start to notice about large interfaith gatherings. And I said, what is it? And he said, well, in the beginning, you walk in and, he was talking about multi-day conferences. So day one at breakfast, you have, the Jews sitting at one table, Christians at one table, Muslims on another table, maybe people are being cordial and going over and saying hi. And then he says, but then by the second and third day, something weird happens. And you actually find you have the fundamentalists sitting at one table and the liberal or progressive religious people, regardless of what tradition, sitting at another table. And the longer I spend sort of in the liberal Jewish world, and also in interfaith spaces, I realize that is really interesting. And I feel like specifically this book is at such an interesting time because from the Jewish perspective, and, everyone listening to this podcast is well aware that we have, divisions in the Jewish community ideologically, and without, spending the next 3 hours explaining why, I think it's fair to say, obviously there's more than two denominations, but at least in America, the real divide is between Orthodox and non-Orthodox. Obviously, there's a lot of gray area in between, defining Orthodox, defining not Orthodox. That's an impossible task. So I'll leave that to the, people who want to weigh in the comment section.
Right.
In terms of the Christian community, what's interesting is, I'm sure this has existed for, longer than Judaism, but I've just become attuned, through reading the Atlantic. I think had a wonderful article about how some churches are being taken over by, QAnon and, very far right attitudes and things like that. And it was written while interviewing a liberal pastor that was basically saying, I don't know what's happening. It just seems like politics is co-opting everything. So I'm curious if you want to weigh into this sort of unique glimpse of, how well does the Christian community in America mirror the Jewish community, either America or in Israel, where it might be more of a parallel because they are, some sense, the religious and political majority, at least by a policy stance.
Right. Ironically, that's the subject of what my next book is going to be about, the ongoing sort of fight for Christian theocracy occurring in our country and the political landscape and that sort of thing, and its effect on Jews and non-Christians. But, I think that from what I have seen in my view, which is, as it's limited to what I've seen, but, and certainly not overarching, but, there is a strong, loud voice to merge Christianity with politics, to rewrite history, Christian nationalism, Christian supremacy, jingoism, these sorts of aspects, about the founding fathers. All of that is happening with a loud voice from what is becoming loud enough that we wonder, is it a minority anymore, right? The fundamentalist, is it a minority more? And more so, more scary about that is the loud voice the minority, but is the silence because, some people in the middle are actually sort of fine with it. They just don't want to say it out loud. In my experience, I've experienced that. At the same time, I've experienced a very strong rejection of that from progressive Christians. And I've been very grateful for that. But as we spoke about earlier, the idea of the bystander is, very, very tough to take in. That if a bystander is silenced, are they really with us, or do they just agree with the oppressor and they just didn't want to say anything? Where do people stand? And that's my questions to people is, where's the marches? Where's the rallies? Where's the stuff? Or is this okay with you? You're just not happy how they're saying it, right? Are the politics what you want anyway, but, they're just being rude about it or something like that. And that's been I've been trying to dig into that a little bit more. And carefully and thoughtfully, I know it sounds sort of a quick remark, but carefully and thoughtfully trying to understand where American Christians, the majority, the minority, where they stand on certain things and what they're willing to do and who they're willing to fight and when they're willing to, rebel and that sort of thing. And it's a little disheartening at this point because I think people are still sort of in shock with what's happening. But I think we're starting to see a little bit more movement, and they're coming to me and other Jewish leaders to say, directly, I've had people say, how do you want us to do this? How can we fight this for you? And that's a hard question to answer. I don't know a lot of the time, but that's where we are right now.
Yeah, it is really interesting. I had a totally other set of questions I wanted to ask, but that last comment just, something just screamed out of my head because what I've seen anecdotally, and I think data, maybe backs this up. I'll let people Google it later, is a lot of times, especially when you have, big Christian communities that want to seem like they're helping the Jewish community, they oftentimes funnel it through Zionism and through very particular right-wing evangelical movements towards Israel, which is missing the point for a whole bunch of reasons. But
yes,
I can't tell you the number of times I live in Orange County, which is, pretty split in terms of blue and red, but we definitely have, a good amount of older Republican Christians. And it is really interesting, when I talk to them, I walk around with a kippah. So, I'm sort of a 24/7 public Jew. And oftentimes I'll talk to them about, random stuff. And they'll say, well, but I donate, or my church donates a lot to Israel. So as if that somehow absolves of any other ideas. So you said that, I just had to sort of get that out.
Please do. And it's infuriating. Christian Zionism is infuriating. And we hear that a lot, not just from politicians, but elsewhere, being like, we say, well, this is anti-Semitic. And they're like, we can't be anti-Semitic. We support Israel. Except for the fact that Christian Zionism has nothing to do with supporting the Jews there. Christian Zionism has the goal of getting Jews to go to Israel and supporting Israel so that it can be the base plate for the second coming and the apocalypse and all that sort of stuff. In other words, the goal is to eradicate us and the world to be converted, and that's why they support Israel. So when a Christian says to me that, I can't be anti-Semitic, I support Israel, I say to them, that's not actually a response. That actually does not help your case at all. And I've encountered even more brash people who say, like, Christians gave you your land back, as in the UN. Like, you should just be grateful and we can just do whatever we want, and basically, like, because the UN voted for the state of Israel, it's okay that they take charge and convert us all.
Yeah.
So I find Christian Zionism to be, like I said, just infuriating, and how people don't recognize that, because, at the very base level, I'm not in Israel. I'm a diaspora American Jew. Certainly, I've lived in Israel. I understand the importance of Israel. But when it comes to addressing anti-Semitism in America, I don't necessarily feel the need to discuss Israel at all.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think I might have said this on a previous podcast, but I'm becoming more and more convinced whenever wider bodies in America talk about Israel. This includes the far right. This includes the far left. This also includes, to a large degree, the American Jewish community. They're really using it as a metaphor for here. And so a lot of times when I hear about Christian Zionism, I oftentimes, the inverse of that claim is that you don't want there to be any Jews here, which, I don't know if that's totally fair, logical derivation from the idea, but oftentimes that's what my mind immediately goes to, because again, Israel is allegorized in just so many ways by so many people, because of the religious and geopolitical significance. But, anytime anybody has these grandiose ideas about Israel, whether it's from the right or the left or religious, not religious, I always take that with a little bit of skepticism.
Absolutely. And, I've on every year when I was a rabbi and Yom HaZikaron or Yom HaAtzmaut came around, it was my least favorite sermon to give. I didn't want to talk about it. I was always going to piss somebody off. And usually I ended up saying, like, look, I'm not the rabbi who's like all into Israel politics. I couldn't tell you everyone who's in the Knesset. I'm anti-settlement. I want human rights, but that's about as far as I'm going to talk to you about it. Like, my specialty, my expertise is Jewish-Christian relations in the diaspora, specifically in America. And so I try very hard to avoid those conversations, which is getting harder and harder, by the way. But it's just something that I don't feel I have the expertise to speak on. And I think I don't want to put people in a position where they're listening to me and my views might be uninformed or overinformed in certain ways or whatever it is. And with the politics and the religion, whether it's reform or it's orthodox or it's left or right, it's too complicated for me. And I say, look, if you want to talk about that, I can recommend some great rabbis who are great about it. They teach about it. They know how to speak about it. That's not my jam. I apologize, but I'm not your guy to talk Israel with.
Yeah, totally makes sense. So what are one or two interesting facts, interesting ideas, you can go as, whatever direction you want on this, about Jewish-Christian relations in America, really your expertise?
Sure. So the one thing I'll say that I think a lot of people are a little taken aback by, but eventually nod and understand, is that the majority of American Christians know nothing about Judaism. And when I say nothing, I mean nothing.
Yes, I can. Sorry to cut you off. I can sign on 100%. I teach an intro to Jewish text class at UC Irvine, and I've had some great Christian students, and I am always not even stunned anymore. It's just as if knowing zero. But yeah,
we're done being surprised by this. We now have to accept it and move forward. The only aspects of Judaism that American Christians mostly know of is the very skewed perception of us in the Gospels, in the Gospel writings. A very ahistorical, almost laughable view of who we were in the first century. So there's that problem. And then virtually nothing about what separates first century Judaism, Second Temple Judaism from modern Judaism, biblical Judaism from rabbinical Judaism. So again, when we say nothing, the nothing carries into many categories of nothing that they know. And if you're going to talk about Judaism, you need to get a handle on those things first. Otherwise, I don't mind questions like that, but one, you're going to get some very irrelevant questions, very accusatory questions, some misperceptions, to say nothing of the anti-Jewish vibes that occur in the Gospels, which makes things worse. And so when I sit down at the table with a Christian colleague or in front of a lecture hall with a group of Christians, my aura has to be, these people know nothing. The only thing they know is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and all of that's wrong. And so they need to relearn and unlearn, and then they'll be ready to learn. And it's a daunting task, but we're able to do it little by little with little aha moments, because little aha moments get them to start to say, what if that isn't quite right? I want to know more. And when they do that, then we've got them on the right path. 100%. It's the ones who don't get there that we're not making any progress with. The ones who, just as if an ultra-Orthodox Jew or a Chabad rabbi, I would meet with Chabad rabbis all the time, who would say, like, no, the Torah is divine. And I would say, well, we don't have much to talk about then. If you believe that the Torah is perfect and divine, whatever, then, that's a stopping point. In the same way, if a Christian says, look, the Gospels are perfect, they're historical, everything happened in them, I'd say, well, there's not much for us to go to there. That's a stopping point for us. But those who are able to push a little bit past that, little by little, I've seen have been able to do that. But overall, to answer your question, American Christians are deeply in need of Jewish education.
Yeah, it's also really interesting because when I was in grad school, I did a lot about the academic study of religion. And, the word religion is a new word, goes back only to the 1800s. And it was, created by Christian Protestant scholars to define religion very much in a Christian sense. And so many of the definitions we use in the Western world, ethnicity, nation, all these words that basically everyone knows now. But if you stepped in a time machine and went to some, medieval village, nobody would have any idea what you're talking about. These are Christian words, not to say that they're bad, but to say that Judaism just doesn't fit into any of these categories. So even
Right.
saying Judaism is a religion, well, there's a lot that doesn't work there. Judaism is an ethnicity. Well, a lot that doesn't work there. Judaism is a nation.
Correct.
A lot that doesn't work there. And even that idea just seems so tough. I remember, one of the first classes, I always ask the question of, the course is Intro to Jewish Text. So I start by asking, well, what's a Jewish text? And then to answer that question, well, what makes someone Jewish? And so I gave a number of examples of different texts. And I asked, is this a Jewish text? Is this a Jewish text? And some of them are, Spinoza's book. Is this a Jewish text, right? Written by, probably one of the most famous Jews in history. Obviously not a very religious text, but it is in some way, he brings in a lot of biblical metaphors, and the students are just, the need to see in these sort of gray area, ill-defined categories, especially about Judaism, I think is so important. And so it seems like, it is a very interesting conversation to have, especially because, it's almost like the joke of the fish doesn't realize it's swimming in water when everything is labeled in terms and categories that are your home court terms. It's so hard to see how somebody else doesn't fit into those categories that you sort of want to prescribe onto the rest of society. So that's a really interesting point.
And I fully agree with you that, these Christian terms, or even if they're not Christian terms, they're terminology that doesn't necessarily fit within Jewish theology, Jewish history. When we say, what the heck are we? Are we an ethno-religion? Like, what does that even mean? I tell people, look, I have taken multiple classes at PhD level, courses that are called, what is Judaism? What is a Jew? Who is a Jew? And the truth is, like, the challenge, we know who we are. The challenge is trying to explain it in a Christian world. And it's hard. It's hard to do that. And what's more problematic is that because it is so limited in this translation of, we're not quite a nation, we're not whatever, assumptions are made and things are made on top of that, right? So you have right now, like the new evangelical movement of the Messianics, who say, well, Judaism is an ethnicity and I can be Jewish and I can believe in Jesus. And we're like, whoa, well, first of all, no, it's not. And second of all, no, you can't, according to Jewish law. And they're like, yes, we can. So besides the, imperialistic aspect of that, but the idea is, from a terminology point of view, assumptions are made from a Christian point of view that just don't work in translation to the complexities of Judaism. And that's another challenge that we find in Jewish-Christian relations.
Yeah, that's really, really fascinating. Is there anything else that we didn't touch? Any other topic, any future content coming out that you just want to sort of tell the community about?
Well, I think that right now, I'm trying to focus on, helping people to read the book, to ask questions. I'm thinking about putting together not a curriculum, so to speak, but a maybe study sheet or discussion questions on my website to go along with the book for book clubs or for adult education, to get people talking about it and to learn about it from that point of view. Because while it's a 200-page book, it's a breeze. There's depth in it. There's stuff in it that, if a rabbi or a pastor or a priest is teaching from it, that can use some questions at the end, or the key points at the end and things like that. I want it to be not just another book on the shelf. I want it to be a go-to. I think Rabbi Mike talked about this. Before we talk about Good Samaritan, let me just check. Before we talk about this, let me check. And I want to be that resource. I want Christians to have that resource. And so I'm going to do my best to not only get the book out, but I'm going to start a new podcast about it, to just sort of talk about it and talk about questions that I've gotten about it. The future books that I'm going to write are going to be based on some of the feedback, what's missing, what people are dying to learn about. I want to gear my ability to educate to the audience and what they need. And so this was the first step. And we're still very much, it came out less than a month ago. Still in the very first steps of this educational tool. And so I'm going to see how far that can go.
Well, a huge mazal tov on the book being out. You can find the book on Amazon. Anywhere else? Is it on
Barnes and Noble, and also, some of the other independent and smaller booksellers are now getting it. If there's a bookstore that you'd rather buy from rather than Amazon or Barnes and Noble, they can always special order it. We've seen that happen all the time. And they know how to do that. So you can pretty much get it anywhere.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Rabbi Mike Harvey, for coming on J-Life again.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.